Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Sounds good.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Good morning. We're going to be starting in about 6 or 7 minutes. We're going to start at 20 after, so go ahead and enjoy your fellowship. Just want to let you know we'll be starting in just a little over 5 minutes.
Welcome. I have the pleasure of introducing Makaira today, but before we start that, just a quick announcement. The bathrooms are right over this way, just basically on the other side of that wall there. If you can't find it, just grab one of us and we can point you in the right direction. Before I introduce Makaira, let's go ahead and pray.
Let's pray. Our righteous and heavenly Father, we thank you so much. We are blessed with life today. You have given each one of us that breath, that measure of health, and we do not take that for granted. We raise that to you as an honor and a glory, and we thank you that as a creator, that you are above all and over all, and you live in us, and it is too wonderful for words. Lord, help us as we celebrate life, as we think about our beginnings and where we are, who we are, how we are. Help us to give you dominion over all things. Help us to realize that you are the creator of the universe and all things, and may we never usurp your authority. Help us always to look to you for the wisdom that we need each and every day. And help us as we deal in a world that seems to forget who you are. Lord, we ask a special blessing upon our country, that we would come back to our roots of goodness, that we would understand you in a better way. And we ask, Lord, that you would be patient with us. Help us to do those things that will be an honor and a glory to you. Bless the seminar today. Bless each and every one who is here. And more than anything, we just thank you for the sacredness of life that you have blessed each one of us with. Watch over and keep us in this day, and help us again to be representatives of you, the Lord Most High, through your Son, Jesus. It is in him that we pray. Amen.
So as I mentioned, I have the pleasure of introducing Makaira today. Many of you from Metro here know her because she and her family attended here from 2005 to 2008. Even though it was just a short time, we still feel like she's one of our Metro kids. I think maybe the folks at Kaiser might argue with that claim, but we definitely claim her. I personally have gotten to know Makaira over the last couple of years, getting to volunteer with her and work with teens with her. And what I've gotten to know about her is that she has a passion for truth. She has a love for people and a love for God. She has her BA in English. I read this so I don't mess it up. In English and Language Literature from Harding, her MA in English Rhetoric and Composition from Boise State University, and she was a secondary English teacher and a first-year college writing teacher. She has joined the pro-life movement officially as the Oregon Right to Life Communications and Outreach Program Manager. This position, she brings pro-life communities across the state together to support women and families. I'd like you to welcome Makaira to the stage and give her your attention.
Hi. Thank you so much, Summer. I have really enjoyed getting to know you over camp and all the fun things we've been doing. So, as Summer mentioned, I'm working with Oregon Right to Life, and that's kind of an unlikely place for me to find myself. That was never in my plan, but God has better plans than we do, right? I've been in teaching and English and in that world, but when I was looking for my next position and where I was going to go next in June of 2022, I thought, well, what better time to get involved in the pro-life movement in Oregon than right now? Like, this is the best possible moment because we're seeing that momentum and we're moving forward. And when it comes to why I'm pro-life, there are a number of reasons. And one of those is obviously because I'm a Christian, and I believe that all humans are made in the image of the living and holy God, and that they need to be respected as such, and their lives need to be protected. But I also am pro-life because I believe that's where truth leads us. I believe that truth and reason are tools that God has given us to understand the world around us. And when we use that logic, and we look at history, and we see how people have treated each other over the years, we realize you have to protect the rights of everyone to protect the rights of anyone. And that's so incredibly important. But I'm also pro-life because of my personal experiences with people with disabilities, people who would have been aborted under the abortion regime in countries like Iceland, which has almost completely eliminated their Down syndrome population through selective abortion. And so these reasons kind of combine and they come together to fuel my passion for the pro-life movement and for protecting lives. So right now I'm working with Oregon Right to Life in our Education Foundation. And maybe you're familiar with Oregon Right to Life, maybe not, but we are a pro-life organization that has been around since 1970, so pre-Roe v. Wade, and we advocate for the rights of the vulnerable. We have a few different arms, so we have kind of the parent organization that organizes everything, and then we also have our political advocacy team, and they do all the lobbying and try to pass the good laws and make some progress on the political side. But my work is all on our C3 nonprofit side, our Education Foundation, that focuses on just educating our communities about fetal development, human development, basic pro-life apologetics, right? Why we believe that the unborn have a right to life. And a lot of people are just really, really uninformed. And I've talked to people. So one thing to know about me is I started this job, and about 1 week later, I was at the Oregon State Fair talking to just about anyone about abortion. Let me tell you, if you want to build a thick skin quickly, there is no better way than to go talk to the general Oregon population about the most controversial topic of the moment, okay? You learn pretty quickly. You're like, okay, I can't care what people think about me. You just gotta stick to your guns here. And so we do outreach, we do a lot of different things to inform our communities, but we're also working to equip pro-life advocates in Oregon with the tools that they need to be effective advocates in your own realms, right? So it's not just telling you the facts, but telling you how you can use those facts to reach others. And then also motivating you and encouraging you to continue doing that work, and then connecting you with the causes that you can help with and the people who need that assistance. And now, as you may have noticed, right, as I discovered when I was at the state fair talking to people about abortion, our society is incredibly bad at talking to each other about just about anything, really. Anything controversial, it's like, la, 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 yell, 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 you're a bad person, and then everyone goes home mad, right? Is that an accurate summary? And that happens whether you're in person, whether you're online, or whether you're just having an argument in the shower with someone that you disagree with, which I confess I have done. And there are huge social, political, cultural problems in our society, and people are just struggling to engage effectively. And if we're going to effectively advocate for truth, advocate to protect the vulnerable, we need to make good arguments and learn to better connect with people who are different from us, so that we can actually engage with their ideas, engage with the person, not who you think the person is, but who that person actually is. And abortion is one of those topics that has always been incredibly difficult to talk about. It's complicated. It's emotionally complicated. It's ethically complicated, philosophically complicated. And over the last couple of years, it's become more and more polarized. People just kind of, here's the line in the sand, this is the side I'm standing on, and I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Unless I'm yelling about it, maybe. There's a lot of attacking character rather than the ideas of the person you're discussing with. And so our goal is to see these conversations get better, to give you strategies you can use to have positive, productive conversations that aren't just yelling at each other. So my goal today is to inform you about the state of Oregon right now, what we're looking at with abortion, but also to give you tools that you can use to productively engage with anyone, anywhere, anytime about abortion. And then, of course, help you with the tools that you need to meaningfully and productively support life. So to do that, we're kind of breaking things up into a couple sections today. And so during this first section, we're going to be talking about Abortion 101. So don't get too excited, I know. And so we're going to talk about appreciating life, the fundamentals of fetal development, a little bit of an understanding of federal and Oregon law. How do we understand the moment in history where we are? And then what you can do about the law in Oregon. And then, if time allows, we're also going to do a quick introduction to the equal rights argument for protecting the unborn. And then in the second session, we're going to go more into the personal element. How do you engage with people? How do you answer those what about this questions? Well, what about this? What about that? What about this? And it's a lot coming at you, right? How do you understand those questions, see the person, empathize with them, but also answer in a logical and compassionate way? And then talk about things that you can do as groups and as individuals to support life. So with that, we are going to get started with Session 1, Abortion 101. And now I'm going to have you do a little bit of a weird activity, so bear with me. So sit for a moment, and I want you to think about everything that is happening right now to sustain your life. Like in your body right now. You have your heart that is beating, pumping the blood throughout your body, pumping the blood to your lungs, where you're breathing, and your lungs are filling that blood with oxygen, and then your heart is pumping and carrying that blood to your brain so you can send signals through your nervous system so that you can move and do all these things that you're doing and speak and enjoy your life. And that is so much that is happening. It's incredibly complex. And we take that for granted. We're like, here we are, we're just living my life. You're living your life, that's incredible. There's so much that goes into that, and we tend to forget what marvelous creations we are, how beautifully and wonderfully made. And so, in order to understand abortion, we first have to understand life and fetal development and how we are who we are. So the definition for abortion, kind of your textbook definition, if you're going to be completely neutral, is the deliberate termination of a human pregnancy. And so first we have to understand, what is a human pregnancy? What is involved in this? Is it a clump of tissue? What do we have here? And so we're going to start by watching a short video from Live Action. This is the Baby Olivia video. They're going to pull it up for us. And this is CGI, but it's been reviewed by doctors as medically accurate, and it just provides a really good overview. Go ahead.
She begins to implant in the uterus about 1 week after fertilization. Her cells organize into what we call an embryo. At 3 weeks and 1 day, just 22 days after fertilization, Olivia's heartbeat can be detected. The buds of her arms and legs appear by 4 weeks. She begins to move between 5 and 6 weeks with both spontaneous and reflexive movement. At 6 weeks from fertilization, her brain activity can be recorded and bone formation begins. She can bring her hands together at 7.5 weeks, and separate fingers and toes emerge. She can also begin to hiccup. At the beginning of the 9th week, Olivia will have grown from a single cell into nearly 1 billion cells, and she is now called a fetus. She will suck her thumb and swallow, grasp an object, touch her face, sigh, and stretch. At 11 weeks, she is playing in the womb, moving her body and exploring her environment. Her dissect Olivia's movements between 14 and 18 weeks, an event called quickening. Beginning at 18 weeks, ultrasounds show speaking movements in her voice box. Around 20 weeks, with a lot of help, babies have survived outside the womb. At 27 weeks, her eyes are responding to light. She can recognize her parents' voices and will even recognize lullabies and stories. Olivia has gone on an amazing journey during these last 10 months. She will soon signal to her mother that it is time for delivery and greet the outside world.
So that is baby Olivia, and no matter how many times I watch this, the scene where she's trampolining in there makes me appreciate my mother that much more, let me tell you. And so one thing I want to make a quick note about is that when we're talking about dating in a pregnancy, there are two types of dating that are used. There's post-conception dating or post-fertilization dating, and then there's gestational age. And gestational age is going to be about 2 weeks later than post-fertilization age. So it can get a little bit confusing at times, but if you're wondering how old a baby is, or you have to think about gestational age versus post-fertilization age. So when we're talking about fetal development during this first section, I'm going to be using post-fertilization age because that gives us a good chronological progression. But then later when we're talking about abortion procedures, that kind of thing, we're going to be looking at gestational age because that's how the law works usually. All right. So pregnancy is usually split up into 3 trimesters of approximately 3 months each, and we're just going to take a quick look at some of the highlights of fetal development in each of these trimesters. So first trimester, we have a lot going on. We have at fertilization, at the moment of fertilization, a complete genetic code is established for a unique human being. At 22 days after fertilization, you can detect the heartbeat. And then at 8 weeks, we have a terminology change where the embryo graduates to a fetus in the language we use. And I want to be really clear here. A lot of times you hear stuff like, oh, it's a fetus, it's an embryo, it's not a human, right? So embryo and fetus are terms that we use for stages of human development, right? So just like we use infant, toddler, child, teenager, young adult, adult, and it progresses, it's starting with that embryo, fetus, infant, child, and on and on. So the terminology we use doesn't really matter that much because it's still a description for a stage of human development. It's not an automatic non-human term. It's actually specifically a human term. So that's something to keep in mind there. And at 8 weeks, we see that shift from embryo language to fetus language. At 10 weeks, the fetus is already expressing hand dominance. So if you're a lefty, or maybe you're right-handed like me and most people, boring, you're already using that hand to suck your thumb or touch your face at only 10 weeks inside the womb. And this image that we have here is baby Noah. And baby Noah was miscarried at 12 weeks, and his parents requested that this image be used to demonstrate just how developed a fetus is at that age. It's very developed, looks like a human, right? In the second trimester, about 14 to 26 weeks, we have some fun things starting. Who's got a favorite food? Anyone? I like ice cream personally, chocolate, anything in that realm. You are already developing food preferences at 14 weeks, which is crazy, right? They actually did a study on this where they had kale and carrots. So what happens is the mother is eating this food, and the food flavors the amniotic fluid, and then the baby can taste it there. So they did carrots, and the babies made smile reflexes. They did ultrasounds and stuff, and it was smile reflexes because carrots are sweet. And then they did kale, right? It was not a smile reflex. So they established that at this young age, they're having those food preferences and can distinguish between kale and carrots and other things. They should have done chocolate. That would have been better. They all would like chocolate, guaranteed. So lots of things happening. We also know that fetal pain starts by 15 weeks. definitely. And new research is indicating that it could be as early as 12 weeks, but we don't have the research to fully back that up yet. But you can say confidently that at 15 weeks, fetal pain is there. Babies as young as 19 weeks have survived premature birth, so 19 weeks post-fertilization or 21 weeks gestational age. They've survived outside the womb. And so fetal viability is considered about 20 to 23 weeks, depending on how you're counting. And this is a really big word in abortion conversations, right, is where is viability? And so viability, right, is the ability to live or survive successfully outside the womb. And we have technology that assists with that. The viability point is now earlier than it was 100 years ago because we have more medical technology to assist with that. At 26 weeks, the fetus can respond to changes in light. So if you've ever taken a flashlight and held it up against your hand and you see kind of that red glow, right, that's kind of what the fetus sees. If you take a flashlight and move it across the mother's stomach, it can track that light and follow it. In the third trimester, about 27 to 40 weeks, we have one really fun fact, I don't always share this, is that a 30-week-old fetus can actually learn. So they did a study where they would read nursery rhymes and then test the fetus's response. You know, is it a new response? Is this a familiar rhythm? All of these things. And at 30 weeks, the fetus can learn a rhyme that is read aloud in 2 weeks, as opposed to the 5 weeks it took to learn that same rhyme at 26 weeks, right? So there's an increasing capacity to learn, become familiar with information and the stimuli that are coming from the outside world. At 30 weeks, we know that the fetus practices breathing almost 40% of the time, getting ready for life outside the womb. And 96.8% of babies born at 29 weeks after fertilization will survive the first year of life. So there's a lot of really, really cool things that are happening in fetal development that we don't always think about. And so sometimes when someone says, well, it's just a blob of tissue or something, what you have to say is, oh, did you know that actually heartbeat starts at 22 days? And a lot of people I've talked, they just don't know. They're like, honestly, I had a terrible health class. I don't know anything about human development. And so it's an opportunity to say, well, did you know? And inform people, because that alone can really, really change their perspective. But with that knowledge about fetal development, we're going to talk about laws, understanding the post-Roe world and kind of how we got here, how all these federal laws are working, and how that impacts the law here in Oregon. So in 1973, the Supreme Court decided 2 cases, Doe v. Bolton and the more famous Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is the one we always talk about, but Doe v. Bolton is also very, very important in this context. In Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court established abortion rights for what they called the health of the mother, and this was based on having pregnancy divided into trimesters. So they basically had a funnel of restrictions. So no regulations on abortion during the first trimester, some regulations during the second trimester, and more regulations during the third trimester. So it was kind of constricting it as the pregnancy progressed. And so that's kind of where we started really latching on to that trimester language. But the Supreme Court also passed Doe v. Bolton, which expanded on what the justices meant when they used that term, the health of the mother. And this is actually a really loose definition. So the health of the mother encompassed physical, emotional, psychological, familial health as well. So it's a whole lot of things. And what it did is it created a giant loophole, right? So over here you have Roe v. Wade saying, you know, here you can do restrictions like this. And then Doe v. Bolton says, well, but here's a giant loophole that you can use there. So combined, these 2 rulings overturned many laws in the US that restricted access to abortion. And so together, they ruled instead that there must be a right to abortion in the United States, that abortion is available for all 9 months of pregnancy, and that the trimester framework is used to determine whether an abortion is acceptable, depending on that trimester framework. And this was the law of the land until 1992, when we had another really important case that people don't think about quite as much. And that is Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey. And this ruling actually opened the door to having restrictions on abortion as long as these restrictions didn't create what they called an undue burden on the woman's right to choose. So here, they moved away from the trimester framework of, no restrictions, some restrictions, more restrictions, to viability. So pre-viability, post-viability. And that was the line that's looked at instead. And now you're looking at major restrictions after viability, after 20 weeks is where they drew that, but not before. And then more recently, we had June 24th, 2022, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. And I gotta say, the last few years, we've been living through lots of interesting and unprecedented times, right? And I'm very tired of living in unprecedented times. But this is one instance that is the exception. I am very happy to be living during unprecedented times, where after almost 50 years, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision. So in this decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided because it used a false legal history to argue that there was a right to abortion in the United States Constitution. But one of the big misunderstandings you have here is that this ruling does not make abortion illegal. And I think that's why so many people were worked up about it. They thought Roe v. Wade made abortion legal, Dobbs made it illegal, we're upset. But really, all that Dobbs did was say, the federal government said, we're washing our hands of this, you guys have fun. That's what it was. It's returning the issue to the states. It's not being decided at the federal level any longer. Now, in some cases, you have states with trigger laws, like Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, Idaho. There's some of the states where they had laws on the books that said, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, boom, we're putting this law into effect. And so you see some really major restrictions that just automatically, they had everything in place for those laws to go in. But other than states like that, it's still just up to the states to decide. And this is where we get to the bad news, right? We live in Oregon, and Oregon is one of the few states without any legislative restrictions on abortion. Abortion is legal until birth in Oregon for any reason. And this is a position so extreme that 72% of pro-choice people actually disagree with having abortion available until birth like this. So Oregon is extreme. So this is a map from the Guttmacher Institute. And the Guttmacher Institute is the former research arm of Planned Parenthood. And so if you look here, you'll see they have their code for most restrictive, very restrictive, restrictive, so on and so forth. And then down at the bottom, you see most protective, that dark blue, purple color. There's only one state on this map that is most protective of abortion rights, and that is our state, according to a pro-choice source. And we're looking at very few legislative restrictions, and some of those specifically are pretty scary. You do not have to be a medical doctor to perform abortions in Oregon. Okay? You also should know that abortion clinics are exempt from the requirements that they have for other ambulatory surgery clinics. They're exempt from those safety requirements. And almost 50% of abortions in Oregon are paid for by Oregon taxpayers. And now that's actually, according to the most recent data, I've seen 55% rather than 50%. And so the details of that are that Oregon requires all private insurance companies to cover abortion with no out-of-pocket costs. And so the only exception that there is Providence, which has an exception because it's a Catholic system. So they were able to get an exception for that. But all of the other private insurance covers, they're going to be covering abortion. OHP, the Oregon Health Plan, also covers abortion. And then there are other elements of funding. So the Reproductive Health Equity Act, under that there is special funding. Someone can enroll to get funding if you don't qualify for OHP or other things. We're also handing out money to different grants to expand access to abortion in rural areas or for people where travel is an issue. So in 2022, last year, the Oregon legislature gave $15 million, and this money is to be for grants to improve abortion access. And so it's being distributed by a company called Seeding Justice. We don't really know where that money exactly is going to go, but it's looking very, very likely that it's going to go at least partially to the Northwest Abortion Access Fund, which pays for people to travel and obtain abortions. And so with other states, when we're looking at being next to Idaho, right, looking at helping people travel, hotel costs, all that kind of thing, in order to come get an abortion in Oregon. And so there's a lot in Oregon. And then I also want to put this into perspective on the global scale. We're so used to thinking about abortion in the United States. It's like, what's Texas doing? What's Tennessee doing? What's New York doing? La, la, la. Let's look at what the world is doing, right? Because a lot of times people point to Europe as an example. And so out of 42 European countries that do permit abortion, elective abortion specifically, 27 of those 42 countries restrict elective abortion at 12 weeks gestation. All right, so in Oregon, it's legal, 38 to 40 weeks full term. It's legal. In Europe, you're looking at 12 weeks. Some of them, it's 12 to 14 weeks. You have 5 that are 14 weeks, and then a smattering that are at other times. 5 of those countries actually restricted at 10 weeks. So Oregon law is on par with China and North Korea, okay? That is where we're at. So when people say this is normal, it's not, right? Look at European countries and see what is typical over there. And I wouldn't say I'd be happy about that. In Oregon, I would be thrilled to see even a 20-week restriction passed. And that would be something considered more permissive in Europe. And so now that we've taken a look at fetal development, the law, how we got here, we need to take a look at abortion itself. And this is heavy. I know it's hard to talk about, but it's also incredibly important. Since Roe v. Wade, 64 million lives have been lost in the United States to abortion. And part of advocating for life is being able to understand why these procedures are dangerous, not only to the children, but also to the women. And so we have to talk about it, even though sometimes I really would rather not. So the one thing to know here is that there are 2 primary types of abortion processes. You have chemical abortions and you have surgical abortions. Most of the abortions in the United States are first trimester abortions. For some reason, the general population is much more comfortable with first trimester abortions. It's kind of considered more forgettable at that stage. I'd encourage you to go back there and check out some of those fetal models. A box you can see 7 to 10 weeks and how developed looking at that age. But first trimester abortions make up the vast majority of abortions in the United States. But first, we're going to talk about chemical abortion. And the abortion pill is now coming to be known as Plan C. It's also known as chemical abortion, or RU486. It was a popular name a while back. Let me be very, very clear here. The abortion pill is not the same thing as Plan B or the morning after pill. And that's where people get kind of confused. I've seen a lot of chatter lately because Walgreens announced that they're not going to dispense the abortion pill in the states where there are abortion restrictions. And I saw a lot of people going, well, why can't they have Plan B? Because Plan B is not the same thing as the abortion pill. Plan B is used when you're not sure whether you're pregnant. It's to prevent a pregnancy continuing. It's used in the very, very early stages where we don't have any definitive data about whether it's actually terminating a pregnancy or not. And there's plenty of room for ethical discussion about whether Plan B is okay, right? But it's a completely separate conversation from the abortion pill. The abortion pill is used when you know that you're pregnant. It's approved by the FDA for use up to 10 weeks gestation. And it works through a process of 2 different drugs. And the first drug is mifepristone. When a woman is pregnant, her body produces a hormone called progesterone. And the job of this hormone is to say, feed the baby. That's what this hormone does. It says, send nutrients, send oxygen, send all the things that the baby needs to grow. And mifepristone, this first drug, blocks the action of progesterone. So it cuts off the communication from the woman's body that says, feed the baby, and says, never mind, there is no baby, don't feed that baby. And then the fetus will essentially starve from lack of nutrition. And then 24 to 72 hours after taking that first drug, there's a second drug, misoprostol, that is taken. And this causes contractions and labor to deliver the deceased child. This is often a very lonely, isolated process. You go, you pick up the pills, you go home, you're left with the wreckage, is what's happening. And women have reported seeing identifiable children and body parts when they were passing that. The abortion pill is becoming increasingly prevalent. It is now responsible for at least over 50% of abortions in the United States. And some people are estimating that it's actually closer to 60 or 65%. It's extremely underreported, and because it's so easily dispensed or obtained other places, it's really hard to track and accurately know. 2021 change in regulations means that it is now easily available online to obtain, and then more recent changes say that it can now be legally dispensed at pharmacies. So Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid all announced that they will be dispensing the abortion pill. And there's recently been some talk about, Walgreens isn't going to do it in these states, that kind of thing. But this is pretty crazy because you have an abortion pill that's going to end the life of a human being, and it's being passed out at the pharmacy where you go to get, ice cream for your late night movie, right? And it's a very interesting cultural shift that we're seeing, but it's also extremely dangerous because the abortion pill is very dangerous for women. So if you have an ectopic pregnancy, the abortion pill is very dangerous. That occurs in about 2% of pregnancies, and it cannot be diagnosed without an ultrasound. That's not necessarily a required part of getting the abortion pill. The abortion pill also has a complication rate that is 4 times that of surgical abortion. Okay? And so it's becoming prevalent because you're like, oh, it's less invasive, it's the chemical, right? But it's 4 times more complications, more ER visits, all kinds of things. And it's also dangerous because if a woman is having complications from taking the abortion pill, she goes to the hospital and she tells them, I'm having a miscarriage, which is what you're often told to do by the abortion pill provider, especially in areas where abortion may be restricted, so that you don't get in trouble or something, right? Don't tell them you took the abortion pill, tell them you're having a miscarriage. If it is miscoded as a spontaneous miscarriage situation, she's much more in danger because they are not able to treat her properly in that situation. So that's one of the dangers of it. We know, according to data from the FDA, that at least 26 women have died after taking the abortion pill. Recommend looking up the story of Holly Patterson back in the 2000s. She died after taking the abortion pill. She was told she would have a safe abortion, that her accident would go away, and that her life would be able to get back to normal. But within a month after having her safe legal abortion, she was dead. Right? This is dangerous for women, and it's a very real danger. But there is some good news in this, and that is that there is something called abortion pill reversal. And so in abortion pill reversal, this was pioneered by Dr. George Delgado a few years back, some other people. This process overrides that first drug. So you have mifepristone, and it blocks the hormone progesterone. It says, don't feed the baby, right? And so in abortion pill reversal, after taking the first pill, but before taking the second pill, a doctor can prescribe bioidentical progesterone that the woman takes that just overrides that signal. And it says, do feed the baby. Please, send the nutrients, send everything. And it is effective in about 64 to 68% of cases, and at least 3,500 babies are alive because of abortion pill reversal. And so if you don't remember anything else from today, the one thing I want you to take away is that abortion pill reversal exists. It is safe, and it is effective. Because what we're looking at is the abortion pill is so prevalent, right? You could be going to the store down the street and run into someone who is walking out with their prescription for the abortion pill. And so this is the news we want to spread to everyone. There is a reversal. It is safe. It is effective. And that news just needs to be shouted from the mountaintops. So that is chemical abortion. And now we need to talk about surgical abortion procedures. And I will be kind of demonstrating how these work with fetal models and real abortion instruments. And this is very, very difficult content, but it's important to know, and that doesn't make it any easier. I am very aware. The first one we're going to look at is suction aspiration abortion, also known as vacuum abortion. And this is performed up to 14 weeks. This is lifelike, approximately accurate 14-week fetus. And in a vacuum aspiration abortion, the abortionist prematurely opens the cervix of the woman, which is dangerous and can also cause preterm birth and later pregnancies, can have long-lasting impacts. And then the abortion provider is going to insert a vacuum, and using strong suction and vacuum will vacuum up the fetus, the placenta, and any other contents of the womb, where they will then be discarded as medical waste. The second one we're going to discuss is dilation and curettage, also known as a D&C. This is performed up to 15 weeks, so a little bit larger than this 14-week model. And in this procedure, the abortion provider will again prematurely open the cervix, and then we'll take a curette. And a curette, this is a curette, it is like a looped knife with a sharp edge, sometimes serrated. And we'll then reach inside the mother's body and then carve away at the fetus. Scrape out the fetus, the placenta, all other contents of the uterus, and then we'll dispose of them as medical waste. The dilation and evacuation procedure is performed up into 24 weeks. I'm going to use this 18-week model here. It is performed in the second trimester until 24 weeks. So this is a 18-week model that I have here. And again, you will have premature dilation of the cervix, and then the abortion provider will take medical forceps, reach inside the mother's uterus, and then tear away at the fetal skeleton, removing legs, arms, head, etc. These body parts will be removed from the mother, and then a nurse or someone is standing by to reassemble the parts to ensure that all of the fetus has been retrieved from the mother. Because if any of that genetic material, which is a completely different makeup than the mother, is left within her, she's at risk for infection. This procedure is additionally dangerous because at times the abortion provider will, thinking that he is grabbing part of the fetus, actually puncture the mother's uterus, grab a piece of her bowel, bring it inside the uterus where it ruptures, which exposes her to infection and danger. And this is how many women have lost their lives to legal, safe abortion. The next one we have is induction abortion. This is performed 24 weeks until birth. And in this procedure, it's considered a late-term abortion procedure. The abortion provider uses a 10-inch long needle and attaches it to a syringe that is filled with digoxin. This long needle is then inserted through the mother's abdomen and pierces the heart of the fetus. The digoxin floods the fetus's heart and induces a massive heart attack. And we know from adult survivors of heart attacks that heart attacks are incredibly painful. We also know that at 24 weeks, the fetus is definitely capable of pain. There's no anesthesia that is administered during this procedure. After inducing that heart attack, up to 2 to 3 days later, the mother is induced to deliver the deceased baby. And then the final one we have is probably the most horrific, and that is the partial birth abortion. This one is currently banned in the United States, but it's one that we know most about compared to other late-term abortion procedures. And it's also hard to regulate, so it's important to know what we're looking at there. So in a partial birth abortion, what we're seeing is in a normal pregnancy, during the first half of the pregnancy approximately, the baby is head up inside the womb. Then about midway through the second trimester, the baby rotates to present head down to prepare for birth, to have a safer delivery for mother and child. In a partial birth abortion, the abortionist will again prematurely open the woman's cervix and then rotate the baby so that the head is facing up. We'll then deliver all of the baby except the head. And this is because that distance, in the eyes of the law, is the difference between infanticide and a legal, safe abortion. Delivers all but the head, and then taking medical forceps will pierce the back of the skull. If you reach up and feel the back of your head, there's that bony part, and then a little bit softer underneath it. That's where the forceps are inserted. Forceps are inserted and then opened, and then the abortion provider will take a suction tube, remove the fetus's brains, crush the skull, and then deliver the rest of the baby. And it's horrifying, but this is our reality. And it's important to know what abortion procedures do, what they do to children, what they do to women. Knowing this information is half the battle. The side effects of surgical abortions can include hemorrhage, infection, retained pregnancy tissue, cervical damage, damage to lining of the uterus, uterine perforation or rupture, injuries to surrounding organs, anesthetic reactions or complications, and in some cases, death. I've personally witnessed an ambulance respond to a Planned Parenthood. There are things that happen, right? And women are endangered as well as the children. And this, of course, is only touching on the physical harm of abortion. It doesn't even begin to address the emotional damage that abortion does. And one thing that you run into when you're talking about abortion is you run into a lot of post-abortive women who are still hurting very, very deeply from a decision they made that they regret. At the fair one time, we had a woman come by and she was kind of looking at the baby models and getting obviously emotional, hurt. She was kind of lingering by our 5-month model, and she shared with us that, I believe it was 10 years prior, she had been forced to have an abortion when she was 5 months pregnant. That was years ago, but it still impacts her very, very much. And it's one of the surprising things about the pro-life movement, or perhaps not that surprising, is that many, many of the key leaders in this movement are women who have had abortions and have seen the damage that it does. And I also need to say here that this is not just emotional damage to women, but to men as well. And it can be a very difficult position for them because they don't always have say legally in what is happening to their child. Or maybe they persuaded the mother to have an abortion, and that harm is still there. There are a lot of abortion healing ministries that are available that help people process that hurt and find grace and mercy and compassion. And that's kind of the two arms of what we do when we're connecting people to community resources, is we have Find Your Care. We'll get you connected with resources, with pregnancy support, with financial support, housing support. We will find you people who will help you, right? That's part of what we do. But part of what we also do is saying, we know it hurts. And society is going to tell you that you can celebrate your abortion, it was a great thing and all this, but that doesn't take away the hurt. And so part of our role is reaching out and saying, we know that this hurts, and we'll help you process that, and we'll sit with you while you grieve. And I know that this can seem very overwhelming, right? We're in Oregon, it's like North Korea, everything's terrible, all of this is available and legal, and our whole culture and society is pushing for this. But it's also an opportunity, right? We have a unique opportunity to speak life into this culture of death and really be different, to make a difference. And I know when I was thinking about where do I want to go, what do I want to do, I could move to the South, I could do something down there, and I was like, or I could stay in Oregon and be a light in this place that really, really needs truth. And, it may not acknowledge that our society needs truth, but it does, right? And we can provide that. But there are things that you can do about the law, in Oregon. So one thing that you can do is make your voice heard by your legislators, because their job is to be in office and then we pester them to do what we want them to do, right? That is the job of the lawmakers. They don't always agree, but that is their job. And so a lot of what we can do is pester them to actually represent what the people want. And one thing that we have is we have action alerts that you can sign up for, where if there's a bill or something going on, we'll send you an email and you can have a pre-typed up angry letter that is nice and concise and explains all your points, put your name on it and send that to your legislator. And right now, I would really, really encourage you to do that, because we have 2 bills in the Oregon House right now that are not good. So one of these is House Bill 2002. And this bill has a long, long list of what it's going to do. But one of those things is that it will remove any age limit on children receiving abortions. It will prohibit any information being shared with the child's parents unless the child provides explicit written consent. Pharmacists will be authorized to provide abortion pills regardless of the age of the patient. Okay, and there's some pretty obvious problems with this, right? So with the current law, if you are under the age of 15, you have to have parental consent to obtain abortion. If you are 16 or 17, you do not need parental consent. You do not have to have any sort of communication. They do not have to have any knowledge. You can be charged to their insurance and they won't see what it's billed for, right? Which is pretty bizarre considering one of my sisters went to get her hair cut once, but she didn't have an adult with her. So it's old enough to drive, but not old enough to choose how long she wanted her hair. And yet, you can go and obtain an abortion at that age. So that's part of what this law will do, which is a pretty obvious problem, because if you have someone under the age of 15 who's getting pregnant, there are responsible adults who should know about that in their life. This enables abusers to be able to continue abusing, to hide the evidence of that abuse, and to keep it all hidden, brushed away, where the parent doesn't have access to information they need to protect their child. It's a huge problem. This law will also add legal protections for abortion providers. So basically, if you violate the law in another state, as long as you are doing it to provide reproductive health care, so maybe you break abortion law in Idaho, you can move over to Oregon and that information will not be given to your employer. It establishes a gag order on public entities that prevents sharing information about ethical or legal violations. It creates a taxpayer-funded program providing chemical abortions at student health centers, at higher education facilities, which will include community colleges. It also creates a new pilot program to provide grants to 2 rural, federally qualified health centers to offer abortions, so expanding access in more rural areas of the state. It also, concerningly, creates a crime of interfering with a healthcare facility, and this part of this bill is pretty clearly designed to discourage pro-life prayer vigils and advocacy outside of abortion clinics. So there's a whole long list of terrible, terrible things that this bill is wanting to do. And so we have to tell our legislators, we don't like that, right? Do not do this. The other one is House Bill 2279, and this one is euthanasia focused. And so this would remove the residency requirement for physician-assisted suicide, meaning that vulnerable people in our entire country would be endangered by Oregon law. So what we're looking at seeing is Oregon becoming a destination for both abortion and physician-assisted suicide. This bill would remove safeguards that supporters of assisted suicide insisted would be in place when it was initially passed. Like, oh, here are the safeguards, don't worry, this is all in place. This bill would remove those safeguards, such as they were. It also is pretty obvious that physicians in Oregon are not likely to have personal knowledge of their patients' history, right? Their medical history, any mental illness, depression, or the details of a terminal diagnosis. They're not going to know those details. They're not going to be able to protect patients in any way. And so it's just expanding Oregon's euthanasia industry. It's like, woo, come to Oregon, it's pretty. Yeah, right? It's pretty messed up in a lot of ways. And so we have to fight against being a destination for death in our state. So that's kind of what you can do a little bit on the legal side. If you are really invested, like, yeah, we got to change these laws, you can sign up and go door knocking and all kinds of things, right? But one of the most important things you can do is have those personal, interactive conversations where you change someone's mind and you have a relationship with them. And so for that, I want to introduce you to the equal rights argument for understanding and sharing the pro-life perspective. How do you think about life issues, and how do you talk about it with others? And the reality is, as I said, I'm a Christian. I believe the Bible tells us lots of things, including why being pro-life is the right thing to do, right? But if I'm talking to your average Oregonian and I say, well, the Bible says so, how's that going to work out for you? Right? They're going to be like, oh, I don't care what the Bible says. Like, what did the Grimm brothers say, right? That's going to be the response. And so we have to have a universal way to talk to people and bring them into this conversation using kind of natural law and reason. And this all hinges on one question. What actually is the unborn? That's what the whole abortion conversation centers around. What is the unborn? And there are three primary characteristics of the unborn child. That is, the unborn is living, human, and whole. So first of all, the unborn is alive because it has the characteristics of living things, right? It grows through cellular reproduction, it metabolizes food for energy, and reacts to stimuli. So it has the characteristics of living things, therefore it must be living, right? 1 + 1 = 2, right? We also know that the unborn is human. And so keep in mind here that we're talking about biological humanness, not necessarily the philosophical part about why the unborn is a valuable person like you or me. So right now we're just sticking to biological humanness. The unborn is human. And we know that the unborn is biologically human because when two living things of the same species mate, their offspring will be a member of the same species. So to break that down into the non-sciencey language, if you got a mama bear and a daddy bear, you get a baby bear, right? Not a platypus. If you have a mama duck and a daddy duck, you get a baby duck. If you have a mama human and a daddy human, you get a baby human. And if you're really, really skeptical, you're not quite sure, we can always do some genetic testing and verify this is human DNA, right? If we're really, really curious. And then thirdly, the unborn is a whole organism. And this tends to be where people get confused. And someone might say, and I've heard this argument, right? Okay, sure, the unborn's alive, has human DNA, but so does the skin cell. Same thing, right? Skin cell has DNA, like when you wash your face, we're not worried about the skin cells, therefore why are we worried about the unborn? And I've seen this argument made, right? And the problem with this is that it confuses parts with wholes. So the unborn is not merely a part of a body, like a skin cell is part of your body. It is a whole organism with its own parts. So humans develop like Polaroid pictures. When the photo comes out of the Polaroid camera, the image already exists. You just can't see it yet. Everything's there, it's just developing and continuing. And as long as it's in the proper environment, it will develop itself given the time. So the embryo has everything it needs, and nothing is added except adequate nutrition and a proper environment, which happen to be the same things that we need today, right? Adequate nutrition and a proper environment. Since nothing essential has been added to you since fertilization, and you're a whole organism now, nothing's been added, then you must have been that same person at fertilization. So the unborn is living, the unborn is human, and the unborn is whole. But as I mentioned, while science can tell us that we are all clearly living humans, it cannot tell us whether we have any value. That is the philosophical question. One of the common responses to the pro-life position is, okay, well, it's human, but the embryo or fetus still isn't a person, doesn't have personhood. And without personhood, they don't think that the unborn has serious moral status and an equal right to things like life. So who is a person? Who deserves equal protection from violence? And to answer this, we're actually going to step away from the question of abortion for a moment, which I know, right? You're like, whew, good thing, I need a break. And we're going to think about rights and human equality more generally. Every human who has been born is someone we clearly consider a person, right? I think it would be equally wrong for someone to kill you as it would be for someone to kill you. Equally wrong. Both people, born, you're here, right? And so that means you're in a little something called the Equal Right to Life Club. And so we have this exclusive club. This is a thought experiment, so bear with me here. We have an exclusive club called the Equal Right to Life Club. And in this club, you only get in if you have an equal right to life. And then, of course, there are things that don't have an equal right to life. And within this club, we can agree that every human who has been born is in this club. So infants and adults, they are all in the club. We're all in this room, we're in the club. Even people who don't look like us or talk like us or have the same opinions that we do, they're all in the club. We agree that they should be there. We are all equal people with equal rights, including an equal right to life. So therefore, in this club, we have all adult humans and infants. But I think we can also agree that not all creatures belong in the Equal Right to Life Club, though. So for example, should squirrels be in the Equal Right to Life Club? What do you think? I mean, you might be like, oh, well, I don't know. Squirrels are cute, right? And now, I will grant you, squirrels can be cute. They can also be evil when they throw nuts at your head when you're walking around. A little traumatized from college, okay? But they still don't have an equal right to life. And we know this because of the way our society works, right? And I'm not saying that we should go around and torture squirrels for fun, because that would be a great time, right? No, I'm not saying that. That would still be wrong. But if you're driving down the road, a little squirrel runs out in front of you, according to the manual, what are you supposed to do, right? Keep going. You do not turn to the right or to the left, because that would be more dangerous to the humans around you. And our goal is to protect the humans. And you feel bad for the squirrel if you run him over, right? But you're not going to pull over and call 911 and report a homicide, right? Because it's a squirrel. It's not a human, and we're trying to protect the humans. So here's what we know. All of the humans that are born, adults and infants, are in the Equal Right to Life Club, and squirrels are not in the Equal Right to Life Club. So how do we account for what makes us equal? There has to be something that lets some creatures into the club but excludes others. There has to be something that makes those with equal rights different from beings without them. So there has to be something we all share equally that gives us an equal right to life. And most explanations here are going to fail. Any degreed property that you can have more or less of cannot explain why we have an equal right to life, because we don't equally possess that property. So for instance, intelligence can't explain why we have an equal right to life, because we're not all equally intelligent, okay? And if you go online and look at any comment section, you'll remember this. And be like, they still deserve a right to life, right? Even though they're not equally intelligent. You know, appearance, not all equal in appearance, not all equally charismatic. We have a lot of differences, and so these degreed properties cannot explain why we have that equal right to life. So let's think about something a little more basic that we do have equally. Sentience. And sentience is the minimal ability to perceive the world around you in some way, okay? And so if the minimal ability to perceive the world around you in some way is what qualifies you for the special Equal Rights Club, how does that work with what we already know? So, would adults get into the club? Yes, adults get into the club. What about infants? Yes. What about squirrels? Squirrels would get into the club if sentience is our bar for how you get into this club. And we already know that's not right. But squirrels are aware of the world. We know that squirrels aren't in this club, so therefore sentience cannot explain why we have an equal right to life. So let's try that out with something a little more advanced that squirrels can't do, like self-awareness, meaning the ability to reflect on one's own existence at all. So if this is the categorization, all right? Would adults get in? Yes. Would infants get in? No. Infants are not self-aware. The most basic form of self-awareness begins at a few months old when babies become aware of their own bodies as a physical object. And that's called first-person self-awareness. Most philosophers, when they're talking about self-awareness, have a more complex ability in mind that actually isn't going to begin until at least 18 months old. So therefore, self-awareness cannot explain why we have an equal right to life. You can try out as many answers as you want, but if your answer is some present ability that you can do now, like sentience, self-awareness, feeling pain, having mental processes, this will inevitably exclude some born humans or include squirrels in the club. So those cannot be the answer. The clearest answer that I can come up with that explains why all humans are people and squirrels are not is that something like our human nature gives us equal rights. That's the only thing that makes sense of what we already know. And we could sit here all day long and test out different things, but I'll skip to the end and tell you, we think it's human nature, okay? And if this is true, that our human nature that we equally have is what gives us equal rights, the unborn must also have an equal right to life because they share that human nature. And we need to protect their right to life if we're going to protect the right to life of everyone. Abortion must be wrong because it violates the equal right to life of a member of the equal right to life community. So keep in mind here, we put abortion on the shelf during that entire thought process, right? So we're not over here yelling about, like, don't you care about women and all that stuff, right? We put that aside, and we're talking about human rights more generally. What do we agree on, right? Equality for all born humans, regardless of sex, race, age, ability, disability, class, all these things. We agree on that already. Most people you talk to, they're going to agree on that, right? And so we put abortion on the shelf. We talk about, okay, why do we agree on that equality? Why does that exist? And then, and only then, do we consider abortion. So if the thing we all possess that makes us equal is something the unborn does not have, right, then abortion would be totally fine, right? If it's something like we've got but they don't, then abortion would be fine. But we know that that's not the case because the clearest answer is human nature. And since the unborn have that human nature, the only logical way to affirm equal rights is to protect the unborn too. And now, if this is correct, if we're right in this, it means that abortion is a major human rights violation. Okay? Abortion is legal, and it's happening hundreds of thousands of times each year. That's the biggest human rights violation of our time. And so this is kind of the thought process that we like to use when we're talking with people. This is called the Equal Rights Argument. It's from the Equal Rights Institute, and we use their material a lot. And I have seen this work with people, dialoguing with people who are truly open-minded and curious. They bring up things like, okay, but what about this? Or like, okay, well, but the fetus doesn't eat the same way we do, right? It's not the same, right? They're not like us. I'm like, okay, well, what if you have someone who uses a feeding tube? Does that automatically negate their right to life? And so you walk through the logical process with people and they start to get it. And it's very cool and it's encouraging to see that there are people out there who are open-minded. You know, if you go talk to people in real life, not on the internet usually, then you will find that there are people you can talk to who will change their mind. I've seen people walk away changing their mind about protecting life because of what they've learned about fetal development or what they've learned about the philosophical pro-life argument. One gentleman I talked to, he walked to me and he was like, you guys are legit. I was like, yes. We're not the crazy pro-life people, right? And so a lot of it is presenting that measured, reasonable response. And so we're about to break here, but during the second session, we're going to get into those what-if questions. Because you can start with this, and then people say, well, what about? What about? What about? And those can be tough questions to answer, right? And sometimes people are really worked up about it, so you have to use some social emotional intelligence to diffuse the situation, right? But it's helpful to be prepared to have an answer for that. All right, so we will break there, and I'll see you back at about 11 or somewhere around then. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, if you can make your way back to your seats, we're going to start the second session. Stop fellowshipping. No, I'm just kidding. All right.
All right, welcome back. Be a second. While you're meandering over, I forgot to mention this earlier, but over in the back, you got a table with some materials, fetal models, all that. We have the 12 to 14 week fetal models. Feel free to take one of those. They're great tools just to have on hand and show people. And I know we've had stories come back where one of those little baby models is what helps someone change their mind because they saw that, they were considering an abortion, and that's how far along they were at that point. So yeah, feel free to take stuff, grab a calendar, grab a baby, all kinds of things. So in this second session, we're going to be talking about supporting life, right? So we can talk all day long about these are the laws and this is how bad it is and this is what's happening. But at the end of the day, it's kind of, okay, so what are you going to do about it? What can you do about it? And the answer is that we have to speak life into our churches and out to our communities. And it's important to recognize the stereotypes and preconceptions about pro-life people. And there are a lot of those out there, right? It's not enough to just have the right answers. It doesn't matter if you win the argument, right? And I love winning arguments, let me tell you. My sister can attest to this. I love winning arguments. It's great, you get the last word, you win, all this stuff, but that's not how it works in pro-life apologetics, because it doesn't matter if you have all the right arguments and all the right facts and they had no comeback whatsoever, because at the end of the day, they're just going to walk and be like, man, that person was a jerk, and move on with their life and not think about this information, right? And so a lot of, half the battle is presenting our message graciously, compassionately, persuasively to people who are not inclined to agree with us, people who have preconceptions, who are thinking about the stereotype about the angry person with the sign that says abortion is murder and yelling at people, that's what they think of. And we don't want to be that person. Because when you're saying something like, I don't think that poverty justifies abortion, what that person is hearing is, you don't care about poor people. And if you're saying, I don't think that rape justifies abortion, they're hearing, you don't care about women who have been sexually assaulted. And when you say, difficult family situations do not justify abortion, they hear, you don't care about women who are in abusive relationships, right? And so it doesn't matter what you actually mean and what you're actually saying. We have to think about what they're hearing. How do we actually connect there? And keep in mind, too, that sometimes in the church, in church circles, we think of abortion as a world problem. Like, we have the church, we got the world, that's a them problem, we're going to help them with it, right? But the reality is that within the church, the standard for sexual purity can actually add layers of shame and fear when an unmarried woman becomes pregnant, and that adds barriers to her choosing life for that child. And that's not necessarily intentional, right? It's not like the church is going around like, boo. I mean, some churches, maybe they are, you never know. But it's still there, right? Those conceptions, those ideas. The reality is that there's a 2015 CareNet study that determined, they surveyed a bunch of post-abortive women, and out of this survey, they found that 36% of women who have had abortions were attending a Christian church once a month or more at the time of obtaining that abortion. The reactions that they reported expecting from the local church were judgmental or condemning. Only 43% of women agreed with the statement, "It is safe to talk with a pastor about abortion." Only 42% of women agreed that pastors teach that God is willing to forgive past abortion decisions. And overall, only 38% of these women agreed that churches are a safe place to talk about pregnancy options. Is this fair? Maybe not. but it's what people are thinking and feeling and seeing. And so think about, what would happen, right, if, say, a teenager in your congregation got pregnant. And that's not actually the question, though. The question isn't what would happen. The question is, what does she think would happen? Right? What you imagine is usually worse than the reality. And so sometimes when we sit back and we assume that everyone is on the same page, people are imagining different things. And those ideas can lead to decisions that they will regret for a lifetime. Your words and your actions matter deeply when you are speaking life. And that can look a lot of different ways. And this is more about your general attitude than it is about, having the exact right argument or saying just the right things. It's about having a posture of compassion and kindness toward people, like as a church culture as a whole, but also as individuals in our own lives. So this is kind of like a laundry list of ideas, of ways that you can speak life and support life and have a culture of life where women who are in unexpected situations know that they have help and support and that they don't have to jump to conclusions in their mind. So one of those things that you can do is be open about your beliefs. And I know that in many situations that I've been in, especially in the academic realm, I kind of just keep my mouth shut because do you want a target on your back? No, not really, thank you very much. But if people don't know that you're pro-life, if they don't know that you will support them and help them, then they're not going to turn to you if they actually need that help, right? So part of it is kind of advertising, like these are my beliefs, and I will stand by them, and I will help you. I will not shame you. I will connect you with resources and things. I'm a safe person to talk to if you need help. Another thing that the church culture especially can do is be clear that there is nothing sinful about the state of being pregnant, right? Now, the actions that led to pregnancy might not have been in line with God's will, but the state of being pregnant is not inherently sinful, right? And that is a big part of the conversation. Be clear that you will not shame, embarrass, or ostracize a woman who is pregnant because of the circumstances that led to her pregnancy. Be clear that you will love and care for unwed mothers and that you will celebrate the lives of their children. And then a secondary aspect of this is simply rejoicing in life and celebrating life. And part of that is celebrating and affirming motherhood. Because we live in a culture that kind of sees being a mother as a second-rate calling, right? And so part of our job is to be the cheerleaders and say, yeah, that's great. What you're doing is great. Model that children are a blessing and not a burden, right? Model that to your children because they're absorbing these ideas and thoughts and taking them forward. What are they hearing? What are they absorbing? So another thing I want to point out here is that specifically in Gresham, you're in a unique situation because you're kind of in the hot spot of Oregon abortions. So Multnomah County, let me backtrack here. So in 2021, the final data says that there were 7,109 reported abortions in Oregon. And 2,264 of those were obtained by Multnomah County residents. And for those who, like me, are bad at math and need the calculator, that's about 30%. So in 2021, about 30% of Oregon's total abortions were obtained by Multnomah County residents. And so that means you are right where you need to be in this area because there are women who are making those decisions on a regular basis. And you never know who you're going to meet, who you're going to speak with, who you're going to impact. And it can be hard, right? Sometimes it's stepping out of your comfort zone. It's asking that one woman if she's doing okay, even though you'd really rather not and just go along with your day, right? And so it's being open to building connections and building relationship and having conversations with people. I know there are plenty of people in my life that at some point we've been like, well, we'll just agree to disagree, right? And so we just kind of detour around whatever topic it is. Just like, well, we'll skip that today, right? But when it comes to abortion, that's one of the topics you do have to kind of reiterate. This is where I'm at, and I will support women. One thing I tell people, if I have a conversation with someone at the fair, it usually ends with, most of the time it's like, I don't think we're going to come to agreement today. Thanks so much. I really appreciate having a productive conversation. But will you do me one favor, right? If you or any of your friends gets pregnant, will you help them find resources first? It's like, maybe we don't even agree on this, but please, here's a list of resources. And if you're ever in this situation or you know someone who's in this situation, please direct them to these so that they do have choices, that they have a real supportive environment that they can have. And so it's not always going to be winning the argument or having the perfect strategy or, parading down the street with all the people whose minds you've changed. That would be great. But a lot of times it's those little connections. One thing I like to talk about is immediate change and cumulative change. And I love immediate change. Those are the moments when somebody, they're like, oh, you changed my mind. And you're like, yes, and you throw a party, and they leave, and you're like, yay, it's great. That's immediate change. Or when you're standing outside an abortion clinic doing a prayer vigil, and a woman changes her mind and doesn't have that abortion, you're like, yes, that's immediate change. But a lot of what we're doing is going to be cumulative change that builds, and you don't always see the impact right away. So part of that, cumulative change, over 49 years of it, that's what led to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Were those little changes, those relationships, conversations that all added up to the bigger change. And that comes in so many ways through you and your conversations and interactions with people in your community. And when you're having those conversations and interactions, you're probably going to have some of these questions come up. What about this? What about that? And so I talked earlier about the equal rights argument and how you build that basic framework. And now we're going to talk about how do you respond with the hard questions? When people pull out the one thing, you're like, oh, I did not want to answer that today, right? How do you respond? How do you work through that? And a large part of that is going to be what we've been talking about with Speaking Life, is just compassion first. Always, always show empathy for the person, that you understand where they're at. And so we're going to talk about hard ones. I don't remember which order I put these in. All right. So we have, what about my body, my choice? That's a really, really big one, right? What about it's my body, my choice? And this one is a little bit complicated because you're getting into the philosophical realm here. And there are two basic kinds of bodily autonomy arguments, and that's what we're getting into here. This is bodily autonomy. There are two types, and there's the sovereign zone bodily autonomy argument, and then there's the right to refuse argument. And so my body, my choice, as a slogan, represents the idea called sovereign zone. And in this view, a woman's body is her sovereign zone, an area where she has complete and total control. She can do anything she wants to her body or to anything within her body. And therefore, because abortion is something that happens within and to a woman's body, it doesn't matter whether or not the fetus is a person. That's completely irrelevant because it's in her sovereign zone. And therefore, she has the right to decide what happens. But the problem for this view is that it actually claims too much. So remember back, I said 72% of pro-choice people do want restrictions on abortion. They do want restrictions. They don't think it should just be anything you want. But the sovereign zone view does not leave any room for restrictions because any regulation would be a restriction of that woman's rights. It would violate her sovereign zone. So that would mean you can't have any restrictions on third trimester abortions when the fetus can generally survive outside the womb. It would mean no restrictions on sex-selective abortions. It would mean no restrictions on abortions targeting an unborn human with disabilities. No restrictions whatsoever. It also means that it is not acceptable to prohibit other actions that negatively impact a fetus. So there's some gray areas, right, about the kinds of things we should or shouldn't regulate about a woman, what a woman can do during pregnancy. So, for instance, taking illicit drugs or getting drunk repeatedly while pregnant can be harmful to the fetus, but there's some disagreement about whether or not those behaviors should be illegal. But there are other more extreme behaviors that everyone agrees must be illegal. Behaviors that are guaranteed to severely hurt the fetus to the point of torture, even. So, back in the 1950s and 60s, there was a medicine called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women to help with morning sickness. And tragically, the medical world discovered too late that thalidomide had severe effects. Taking thalidomide during pregnancy caused about 10,000 babies to be born without arms and legs or with other very severe birth defects. And today, pregnant women are not allowed to take thalidomide because we know this. Regardless of the reason, maybe they have really bad morning sickness, or hypothetically, maybe someone's trying to purposefully deform their child. I don't think that's a common thing, but hypothetically, those actions would have to be legal under the sovereign zone view. Because if the sovereign zone position is true, we cannot regulate anything. If she wants to take thalidomide to help with morning sickness, that it's within her body, that is her sovereign zone. If she wants to purposefully deform that child, that's her body. It's within her sovereign zone. And now, I don't think that women are trying to do these things, but it serves to show the clash there, right? We want to regulate some things, but also it's completely her zone. That's not logically consistent. This position also means that any health regulations on abortion facilities can be construed as interfering with a woman's right to bodily autonomy. Right? She can go to whoever she wants, wherever she wants. And most people think there should be regulations there, health regulations, safety things, all that, even if they agree with the pro-choice perspective. And since the sovereign zone says the government can't regulate the safety of abortion procedures at all, and most people want at least some regulations, this position can't hold true. It's incompatible with the type of view that most pro-choice people have. And that's why, rather than the sovereign zone, many pro-choice people use a different argument called right to refuse. And this one can get a little bit complicated too. This is the fun part, right? When people ask these questions and you have to try to explain it all in a few minutes before they get frustrated and walk away. You know, that's why it's relationships and longer conversations that are so important. But with the right to refuse argument, someone will say, okay, maybe I can't do anything I want to anything inside my body, but I can at least refuse to let other people use my body as a life support machine, right? I have the right to refuse that you use my body. And so there's kind of a famous thought experiment about this that says, okay, so imagine, I have another thought experiment, so pull out your imagination cups, right? Imagine you wake up and you're in a hospital bed and you're connected to all these tubes, you're lying there, you don't know what's happening, and then you look around and you see that there's a tube coming out of your side and connected to this person lying in a bed next to you. It's like you're connected, but you don't know what's going on. And so suddenly the doctor comes running in. He says, oh, good, you're finally awake. So let me explain what's going on. You've been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers because there's this super great violinist, and he has this rare condition, and you are the only one whose body can help keep him alive. And so you've been kidnapped and connected, and you're here, and you're what's keeping this guy alive. So sorry, but thank you from the Society of Music Lovers for keeping this musician alive. So, but here's the problem, right? Thanks for being here, but you're stuck. If you disconnect from him, he will immediately die. And he's a person with the same equal right to life as you, so can't disconnect, right? But there's a little bit of a difference here, right? So even though the violinist will literally die if you cut that tube, sever that support, you still have the right to do so, because the government should not force people to donate their time and bodily resources to other people. I think we can agree on that one. The government should not kidnap you, or the Society of Music Lovers should not kidnap you. That's wrong. But the connection that is usually used is to pregnancy. And so even though the unborn is a person, even though it has the same equal right to life as everybody else, even though it's going to die if the pregnant woman refuses the right to use her body, The government shouldn't force a woman to donate her body to an unborn person. And this is an argument I've been seeing more and more, right? The government can't make you donate the use of your body to an unborn person. We don't force organ donation, so we certainly should not force pregnancy. Women have a right to refuse the use of their bodies by other people, period, the end, no more argument. Now, the right to refuse arguments have an initial plausibility that some other bodily autonomy arguments lack, right? And this is the kind of bodily autonomy that helps us understand why sexual assault is wrong, right? The idea that this is my body. But bodily autonomy has limitations. So let's think back to the violinist. You're connected in the hospital. You hypothetically have 3 options. You could help the violinist by staying hooked up until his disease is cured and you can disconnect safely, say for like 9 months for the sake of the argument. He needs that long to be cured. Or you could not help the violinist, which means you refuse to stay plugged in to the violinist. They would die, and maybe you'd be a bad person or something, but it's probably not illegal. Or hypothetically, as your third option, you could actively kill the violinist, because if he's dead, doesn't need to use your body anymore, right? You could just shoot the violinist right now, he'd be dead, problem solved, you can move on with your life. So your 3 options would be help, not help, or kill the violinist. But we all know that you should not be able to do the killing option, right? That one is off the table. Because generally speaking, as a society, we can agree that killing is always wrong except in cases like maybe self-defense. So the killing option should be illegal for you to do, but helping or not helping should be legally available options. The problem is that not all 3 of these options exist in every scenario. So we're going to take off to another thought experiment here. So let's imagine that you suddenly come into this inheritance. You're like, yes, got all this money, and so you go out and you buy a boat. You take your yacht out to the ocean, you're having a great time, you're sailing, you're an hour off the coast, and a storm kicks up, right? And you're in shark-infested waters, and you're out there, and your fun day turned to not quite so fun. And then you come around the corner on your yacht, and you discover a toddler who had somehow gotten onto the yacht when you were at the dock and is now there on your boat, an hour from shore, in the stormy, shark-infested waters. Now, it's your boat. You could say, I refuse to let you use this boat, and then kick the toddler off the boat, but that would automatically result in death. That would be killing. There is no not help option. There is, you can help, take the toddler back to shore, or you could kill the toddler by throwing them off to the sharks. There is no neutral zone. There's no disconnect. And that's kind of what we're seeing in pregnancy, right? There is no not help option. The only way to disconnect is through actively killing. And since we know that actively killing an innocent human is wrong, that cannot be the solution here. And now, of course, this is a simplified comparison, and there is no comparison to, taking your boat out for a fun day to the physical effects of pregnancy, right? But that still doesn't change the fact that there's no way to just unplug from a fetus to stop being pregnant. So like hypothetically in sci-fi world, if you could just beam the child out of the womb and then put them in an artificial womb, something like that, that could be great. That would be a great option. We'd be willing to talk about that. But we don't have that option. It's not there. All we have is help or kill. Those are the only options. And so the response to this is that while you do have a right to your bodily autonomy, and that's incredibly important, you do have the right to refuse the use of your body to someone else for organs or whatever. That's also incredibly important. But those rights have a limit. None of us have the right to kill innocent people ever. And that's the long version of the response to the bodily autonomy argument. And, you can shrink it down super, super short. It's hard, but you can. But this is the one that most people get hung up on. But another what about question that comes up is, what about rape? And for a lot of the hard questions, the way that we think about it has the same framework, and that is trot out a toddler is the term for it. And so this has 4 basic tenets, is you're going to affirm the concern, brace them for a story, create a parallel situation, and then describe the logic. And so the first thing you always want to do is affirm the concern. So if someone says, well, what about rape? Right? You don't say, well, only 1%, wah, 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 because they're hearing, well, that's a lot of women still, right? That 1% is a lot of women who have experienced rape, have that trauma, and their lives matter too. Their stories matter too. So when we dismiss it and say, well, that's just a tiny percent, people don't respond well to that. So we want to affirm that concern and say, yeah, that's horrible. I think that rapists should be prosecuted, that we need a better system for charging people who have committed sexual assault. Women need to be protected more. There's so many things we need to change that are messed up, right? But then you're going to brace them for a story and say, okay, do you mind if I take a minute to kind of use a little thought experiment here to tell you a story? Let's suppose that there's a woman who tragically is raped, and she becomes pregnant from that. And it's very hard, but she has a good therapist, she has a good supportive community, and she ultimately decides to keep that child. So she has the child, things are going well, she's moved into a new place, they have a good home, she's got a good job, everything is going great. And then the child begins to get older, he gets 2 or 3 years old, and he begins to resemble the father more. And the facial features resemble the father, and it becomes really, really hard for this woman. She's experiencing flashbacks. She's just having trouble seeing the face of her rapist in her child, and she can't reconcile this. And what is she going to do? Would we ever say in this situation that it would be okay to kill that child to remove her suffering? And now most people, they're like, absolutely not, right? That's not an option. You get adoption or something, right? There are other families that could take this child. Say, okay, so let's say this woman says this child, she can't do it anymore, right? And so she calls up the adoption agency, says, I need you to take this kid, I can't do this anymore, I just need someone to adopt him, it'll be so much better then. And she's just really torn up about this. And the adoption agency says, yes, that's great. We can get back to you in about 9 months. We're backed up right now. There's World War III going on. We're just kind of busy. But in a few months, we'll be able to get back to you and connect this child with another home, right? What about then? Since it would have to be a while before he can go to a loving adoptive family, that she would have to take care of him in the meantime, does that mean that it would be okay to kill the child to resolve this issue? And most people can agree that no, killing someone is not the answer. And so when you bring it back to abortion, what you're saying is like, I believe that the fetus inside the womb has the same moral status and right to life as that toddler. And so therefore, if it's wrong to kill the toddler because of these circumstances, it's also wrong to end the life of this unborn child. And the thing is, you always have to affirm, that doesn't make it any easier, right? That doesn't just suddenly like, whoa, adoption wipes away the trauma of rape and sexual assault. Not at all. But what we do know is that rape is so horrible because it's a violent offense against an innocent person, and that creates trauma. Abortion is also violence against an innocent person. And when you take violence and stack it on top of violence, that does not cancel out the first trauma. That creates additional trauma for that woman. And so seeing abortion as a way to fix the problem or just kind of delete the issue like it never happened, that is not going to heal this woman. That's going to add more layers of trauma and hurt to her life. And that's hard to understand at times. So a lot of times when we're talking about the rape question, it's sitting with people and saying, I think this way because I care. And I'm not trying to dismiss the hurt and the pain and the feelings. I want to help women. And there's nothing that is going to take away the trauma of rape. And that is one of the biggest questions that you'll be asked, guarantee. Another one that comes up is, what about poverty? What about, this child is not going to have a good life, and can't raise the kid, all these things, so therefore it would be better. And again, the strategy for answering this is to trot out a toddler. Say you have an impoverished woman, she's bankrupt, she's homeless, all these things, and she discovers she's pregnant. She decides to keep the child, she has a great supportive network, all those things, and ends up getting a new job, is able to buy a house, all these things. The kid's getting older, it's 2 or 3 now, and then she loses her job. And there's a bunch of inflation, and the economy changes, and all of a sudden she's in dire financial circumstances, right? Again, if you look at this kid and be like, sorry, you're in a poor situation now, is the solution ever to kill that child? The answer is no. So again, the same moral status, if the unborn child has that moral status and that equal right to life as that toddler, then the circumstances are not an excuse to kill that child. And bringing out the toddler comparison helps a lot of people to see the humanity of the unborn and understand why that's a bad solution, right? Killing cannot be the solution. There's another one that comes up quite a bit, and that's, what about the mother's health? What about medical exceptions? What about this? What about that? And there are some valid concerns there, and a lot of people are concerned because they do care about women, they care about their access to care, all of that. And so you always, again, affirm that concern, say, I can tell you really care about women, and you really want to make sure that they have access to the health care they need, all of these things. But when we're looking at health and the mother's health, there are about 4 main categories that people are usually thinking of. One of those is ectopic pregnancy treatment. Ectopic pregnancies occur in about 2% of pregnancies, and it occurs when the embryo implants somewhere besides the uterus, usually in the fallopian tubes. And this is a no-win situation. If it is not treated, the woman and the embryo will both die. Ectopic pregnancy treatment means that the embryo has to be removed. There's no way to save both. So in this case, the pro-life approach is we want to save the life of the mother. And when science advances so that we can save the life of both, that would be fantastic, but we are not there yet. And so ectopic pregnancy treatment is sometimes called a salpingectomy. It's sometimes called an abortion. And this is where it gets confusing because it's the terminology that's being thrown around. But the bottom line is that there is no pro-life position that advocates against providing ectopic pregnancy treatment. Every pro-life law has exceptions for this. And you'll see things that say they don't. You go to the text of the law in places like Texas, you read the actual law, there are exceptions for ectopic pregnancies. Another category that comes up is miscarriage care. And now the medical term for miscarriage is a spontaneous abortion, and this is different from an induced abortion. That's the category that we're looking at, is induced abortion, something that is caused. A spontaneous abortion is just, the body cannot sustain this life, and the child tragically dies. But sometimes after a miscarriage, when the child has already passed away, there are procedures that are required that are using the same techniques and tools as induced surgical abortions. So a DNC, maybe a D&E. Those are using the same tools, same techniques. The difference, though, the really major difference, is that miscarriage care is doing this after the life of the fetus has already ended. A tragic situation in order to provide health care for the mother. Whereas an induced abortion occurs when that child is still living. And again, when you look at the law, there are always exceptions for these cases, right? And sometimes what we see is that there's confusion about what the medical professionals think the law means versus what the law actually means. So we have to improve the communication there, right? And make sure that women are getting the care they need. But the law itself does not need to change there. Another category is just the mother's health, because pregnancy can be hard on a body, and sometimes the pregnancy will endanger or compromise the health of the mother. And in these cases, the pro-life view is that you want to treat mother and child like patients. So what happens sometimes is that the child is viewed as the disease or the problem, right? You get rid of the fetus, then the issue will disappear. And that's not really the case. When doctors treat the woman and the fetus both as patients, abortions for the mother's health aren't happening. Sometimes there may be a need for an early delivery, having preemie, that kind of thing, but they're able to keep the baby inside the mother until viability and then provide treatment outside the womb to both. And that is when you talk to doctors who have treated women, who specialize in this, that's what they say. They've never seen a case where you actually need an abortion to save the life of the mother. And then the fourth category that we have is fetal abnormality. And so in this case, an abortion may be deemed medically necessary because of a fetal diagnosis. Sometimes this happens because there's genetic testing or screening done, and it's decided, well, this child is going to be born with this condition. And we don't think that's good. We don't think that's going to be a good life, and therefore an abortion is performed. Sometimes this happens with things like fetally terminal diagnoses, where find out that the fetus has a condition and will die shortly after birth. One thing I highly recommend doing is watching a video on YouTube called Choosing Thomas, and it's a story about parents who learned that their child was diagnosed with trisomy 13 before birth, and they knew that he was not going to live very long. But they chose to carry him to term and to enjoy his life as long as it lasted. And these are tragic situations, right? They're not easy. But we also know that actively choosing to end the life of that child is going to have consequences for those parents, right? And that's a hard choice. It's hard to be in that position, but medical experts have been known to be wrong on occasion, right? And I've, heard stories about people who said, well, the doctor said this, and I have a healthy kid, And so we always want to try to treat mother and child, to value life, to understand that a disability or a difference does not mean that you no longer have that right to life. If you're bored one day, I can recommend looking through kind of the archives on the website of the United States Holocaust Museum. There's a lot of information on there. And as I was going through that one day, I noticed that there's a lot of language about life unworthy of life. That was a really big theme there. And that same theme is what we often see when talking about abortion for medical reasons or a diagnosis of a disability, is that this life is not worthy of life, which is incredibly disturbing, because what kind of message does that send to the people we know who are sitting in our circles who maybe have that same disability as what we're considering no longer worthy of life inside the womb? And so it's funny because sometimes I hear the pro-life movement called ableist, but I can't think of anything more ableist than saying that someone with a disability does not deserve the right to life because you don't think the quality of their life is what you want it to be. And that's a hard thing, but it's a true thing. And as a society, we have to be vigilant in protecting the rights of the vulnerable. We must value people for who they are intrinsically, not what you can do. What kind of society is that if you're valued for what you can do only? It's pretty horrible. It gets bad quickly. If we don't value people for who they are, we cannot protect the rights of anyone, the born or the unborn. So those are the main categories of questions. I mean, there are a lot more that pop up, and it can be a learned skill to address some of those. But we also want to support life. What can we do to support life in tangible ways? And so I'm going to kind of just talk about what's out there. What are some of the things? Be informed about your local resources. Know where your local pregnancy resource center is. Know about your food pantries and housing assistance and all those things, so that if someone comes to you and is like, hey, I kind of need help, you don't have to be like, I don't know, hold on, let me find out something. You say, I know exactly where to send you, right? I know exactly the person you need to talk to. So be informed about those pregnancy care resources. Be informed about abortion healing programs and where you can connect people if they've been hurt by abortion. One of the ways that you can help is through sidewalk advocacy or prayer vigils. We know, so a prayer vigil, 40 Days for Life is one of the most common ones. And they do 40 days campaign in the fall and in the spring, where they have 12 hours a day. The goal is to have 2 people outside the abortion facility praying. And sometimes with signs, sometimes not with signs. They have a lot of different things. But what we know from Abby Johnson, she was the woman that Unplanned, the movie, was about. She was a former Planned Parenthood director before she became pro-life. And one thing she told us from her meeting with Planned Parenthood shortly before she left is that they said when there are people outside praying, the no-show rate for appointments can skyrocket as high as 75%, right? It goes up. We also know more recently, I think it was this month actually, or last month, it would have been February, there was an article that came out. The director of a Planned Parenthood in California was complaining about the people doing sidewalk advocacy and talking about how much their no-show rates had gone up. And I believe he said 50 to 55% was the number that he put out there. As, I can't believe they're driving down our business, our no-show rates went up this much, and little did he know, all the pro-life people, like, yes, we have statistics. Right, so it really is effective. It does work. There's currently a 40 Days for Life campaign happening in the Portland area. They are at the Lilith Clinic in Portland. Lilith is a dedicated late-term abortion provider in Oregon. A lot of late-term abortions are actually happening in hospitals, places like that, because it's a more involved procedure, but Lilith is a clinic specifically dedicated to doing late-term abortions. You can also do an Embrace Grace group, like I know you're doing here at Metro, right, where you're having resources and support and a group that's ready to love and help women who are getting ready to single parent. You can have support groups for mothers, fatherhood coaching. I talked to someone in Hood River last week who's looking at starting a fatherhood coaching program, because a lot of what you're seeing is fathers who don't know how to be involved. Maybe they didn't have a father figure in the home. And how do you be a good father when you never had a good father? And so that's one of the things that people can do. You can individually mentor people. And keep in mind, not all of this has to be like, here I am, and I am helping a vulnerable person. A lot of this is just people you know. It doesn't have to specifically be, here I am saving a life, or here I am doing this thing. It's just serving and supporting life in a number of ways. So support groups for mothers, fatherhood coaching, individually mentoring people, providing transportation to local resources. Like, hey, do you need a ride to the place for the food pantry or housing? Transportation can be a hard thing. Foster care, support networks for foster and adoptive families, or even families with special needs. CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, is another way you can get involved with the foster care system. Maybe you don't have the capacity to foster a child, but you can meet with them, help advocate for their needs in court. I think those are all ways that you can support life. But at the end of the day, it's really going to come down to those individual conversations that you're having with people, the relationships that you build, the networks, the support, the knowledge of the resources where you can send people. And that's kind of the core of the pro-life movement. One thing I am so encouraged by as I'm in this position is I travel around and I'll visit a pregnancy resource center, like, okay, how are you guys doing? Who's helping you out here? And they tell me about, this church does this, and they fill out these baskets, and we have this group that helps us with this, and then we partner with this furniture store that helps provide credits so that people can get furniture for their house if they need the crib or anything like that. And there's this network of all this variety of ways that you wouldn't even think about. Like furniture, I wouldn't be like, oh, that's a need in the pro-life movement, right? But there's so many needs, and there's so many talents and skills that people can use to fit those needs. And it's really beautiful to see how that happens and how people are impacted by that. Now, I should have braced you and told you to be saving your questions, but it is question time. So, if there's an argument you've heard that you don't know how to respond to, or something you've heard and you're not sure it's true, whatever you've got, throw it at me, and I'm ready. 1 second, please. Oh, stand by. I want to make sure we can hear you.
Check.
That one there.
Where we at? Raise a hand or something.
I don't know about using a microphone.
We want to hear you.
Actually, I have a whole bunch of questions, but one that I had a discussion with somebody about is, I think she actually works for DHS, removing children from homes, abusive situations, and she is pro-abortion because of all the violence and trauma, torture of children that she's seen. How can we bring these children into the world when they're going to be in that kind of situation? Isn't it better to abort them so that they're not in this horrible situation?
Yes, and that's a very big question that I've seen a lot. And one of the problems there is there's kind of a fundamental misunderstanding too of what the foster care system is versus what the adoption system is. And so if you want to give up a child for adoption, if you choose to place a child for adoption, there will be no waiting period. That child will not be going into foster care. I believe the statistic is 30 families waiting for every baby that goes into the adoptive system, right? So there's no wait time there. So first we have to separate and make sure that this is the adoption route that is different than foster care. One of the concerns, however, that's often raised is, okay, so maybe this woman decides to parent, she's not equipped to parent, and then later on down the road that child ends up in foster care in an abusive or traumatic situation. And that's kind of what people are concerned about. If she's not equipped to parent, she decides to parent, ends up in a bad situation. And I mean, first we always want to affirm that concern, like, I really care about children in foster care too. There's a lot of really messed up situations out there, and we need more foster parents, and we need more people to step up and help with this and advocate for these kids. But we also have to realize that the foster care system is focused on reunification. So the whole goal of the system is to reunify children with their parents. And that's why you end up with those back and forth and moving situations that are really, really hard on kids. But ultimately, the goal is to reunify. But then sometimes it's just hard, and it's a hard life, and there are hard things. But if you have a hard life, you still have a life, right? And having a difficult life and facing tragic things does not mean that you are less valuable as a person, right? So when we say that, if you were going to grow up in the foster care system or something, then, well, you should have just been killed. That doesn't make sense, right? It's a hard life, and we want to make that life better, but we don't go around being like, oh, you had a hard life so far, I just don't have a life. That's not the solution. And so the solution that we want to see there is pouring work into the foster care system and protecting children and having good systems there. But the answer is never going to be to kill an innocent person. And so it kind of comes back to that every time, is it's never right to end the life of an innocent human being. And that's hard because the foster care system is messed up, and I wish you could just say, oh, boom, it's fixed, but it's not. But it doesn't change the fact that it's still wrong to end an innocent life. What else do we have?
Before I stick this in your face, if you hold the mic facing your mouth, it'll pick up much better, and then you don't have to push it all the way up into your face. I'm happy to hold it for you if you like, but I feel more comfortable with letting you hold it.
I recently had a conversation with somebody that brought up the terminology viable, when a baby is viable. And at conception, is there a heartbeat? I mean, I know I read somewhere it was later, but, so what can you say to that? I mean, I understand what I believe, but, you know,
Right.
for somebody who doesn't believe that.
So they're saying, viability is the point. So one thing, it's good to just inform people about what the current law in Oregon is too. Be like, I don't agree with you there, but I would love to see some restrictions at viability in Oregon. Even that would be a huge amount of progress. But then I like to ask questions about, so why there? What's the difference? And then as people answer, you start to see more and more, it's like, well, it's different in this way, it's different in that way. And so that's why we kind of go back to the equal rights of, well, we're all still equal. We have an equal right to life despite these differences. And, I spoke with someone who was concerned about consciousness or understanding the world around. Like, okay, well, if you have someone who's in a coma for a predictable amount of time, maybe to treat some medical condition, you don't say, oh, well, they're different now. They don't have a right to life. And so sometimes it's kind of bringing in comparable situations to see the humanity of the unborn. But a lot of it is just listening and asking questions and trying to understand how they came to that perspective, and that can take time. It's not always going to be an immediate change, but giving people things to think about, asking good questions will really help with that.
You can hold it. I was wondering if you had spoke at all about Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and a great, not great, but a person who actually, out of evil intentions, wanted to practice eugenics and the murder of African American children. I think it was in the 30s or late 20s that she began.
Yes.
I wanted to know a little bit about how you feel about the impact of that on the African American society today. Not that, you're not African American, but you probably have done some studying and research. And also, out of the 60+ million babies who've been aborted since Roe v. Wade, what percentage of that is African American babies? And there's a lot of misconceptions in the Black community about abortion, and also about, I won't get into politics, about the Democratic Party being, part of our source of freedom and, economic getting out of how can I say this, out of poverty and disparity and a lot of the societal things that have caused African American people to have socioeconomic problems and issues. Not that you have to go into that. I just mainly want to know about the impact of Margaret Sanger and the percentages.
Absolutely. For the percentages, I would have to go look that up. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but it is very much disproportionate to the percentage of Black Americans in our general population. The relative percentage of abortions performed in those communities is much higher. And for those who are unaware, Margaret Sanger was kind of the founder of Planned Parenthood back in the day, and it was founded very much on eugenics and keeping the population from reproducing in certain areas. And this isn't always the most effective thing to bring up today because people don't want to believe it. And so you can see the impact if you look at Planned Parenthood and where they tend to target communities. They're usually in communities that have a lot of minorities in that area. They're impoverished, and they specifically focus on providing access to those communities. So looking at location, you can definitely see those patterns. It's not always the most helpful thing to bring up because people have such a glamorized idea of what Planned Parenthood is in their minds. So even just talking about the statistics about Planned Parenthood and what services they actually offer and how much abortion is what they're making money in, because a lot of the focus is pushed to other services that they provide. And the reality is those services are a tiny, tiny percentage of what they do overall. So it's primarily abortion is what they're doing. They're targeting minority and impoverished communities. And I wish I knew the statistic off the top of my head, but I'd have to look that up later. Thank you. That's a great observation, question.
In the United States, the abortion rate for black women is almost 5 times that for white women.
It's very disproportionate.
That was 2008, though.
On there?
I guess 2 things. First, I've been listening to kind of a conservative speaker in the afternoons coming home from work, and he mentioned an organization, which I can't remember right now, but they actually are seeking donations to pay for ultrasounds, because they said the percentage of people that don't go through abortion when they have an ultrasound
Yes.
it's really, really high. I think my question is, you mentioned earlier about the surgical, or the chemical, the pill, the abortion pill, and I've never really heard of that. And that makes me wonder, what kind of political pressures are you going through in your organization?
Yeah, so with the organization, there are several that raise funds to help with ultrasounds and kind of mobile pregnancy resource units where they can go around, park different places. The one that's coming to mind right now, I believe, is called Save the Storks, and they provide ultrasound machines and mobile units to different areas. With the abortion pill, there is a lot of immediate change and pressure that's changing very rapidly, the face of that. It was just, my timeline is all messed up. The last few months have gone so quickly. It may have been December, I believe, when the FDA said they were going to approve pharmacies to dispense the abortion pill. And so now we're looking at Rite Aid, CVS, Walgreens, and going from, these being the abortion providers or dispensers of the community to it being just everywhere and being widespread and ubiquitous. And that is one of the big pressures right now. And then fighting with this bill to make sure that pharmacists can't just prescribe that to children of any age. And so there's kind of a constant pressure in Oregon politics where we're just trying to move forward. And there was one of those things would be the Born Alive Infant Protection bill that died in committee last year. So we basically were not able to get Oregon legislature to get behind a law that would require life-saving care for infants who are born alive during botched abortions. And so that is very tragic, but we also know we have these politicians on the record now, so that's part of it.
In Christian circles, we are often reluctant to talk about birth control because we don't want our children to, we want to talk about saving sex till marriage and abstinence. And so how do you address the accusation that we leave our children unprepared for pregnancy planning and for family planning? How do you talk about birth control prior to the event instead of abortion afterwards in those Christian communities?
Right. That's a great question, and it's not really my area of expertise because we kind of focus on what happens after the pregnancy occurs, and that's our focus. With what I have noticed, though, as the general trend is that as young people are more informed about pregnancy and fetal development, that is a kind of birth control in and of itself, right? Knowing how pregnancy works, understanding that responsibility, and understanding that abortion is not an easy fix, that goes a long way in helping young people make responsible decisions, for sure.
I actually had this discussion with Mr. Vaca here. Do you remember our discussion? So the goal of Oregon Right to Life to totally ban abortions? Or is it to, I mean, that's going to be the ultimate goal probably, but is that attainable?
Right.
No. So is it like a heartbeat bill? I think Texas has done a lot of those, or a pain bill, ability to feel pain.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, there are a couple different groups in the pro-life movement, and there is the restrict everything all at once approach, and then there's the incremental approach. And so something like the heartbeat bill is still technically incremental, but it's very close to a full restriction on abortion. But in Oregon, what we're looking at is probably more of an incremental approach, where we're rolling it back from elective abortion until birth to maybe a viability point or a pain-capable point would be fantastic. That's just given the demographic of our state and where people are, those are the most likely places to be able to pull it back. But we're also seeing that everyone's just up in arms right now. So part of it is just holding the status quo too as well, and making sure that this does not go further in removing the age restrictions for children, that kind of thing as well. So in an ideal world, it would be that abortion is not only illegal but unthinkable as an option. But right now what we're looking at is more of the incremental approach in rolling things back piece by piece and focusing on education as a primary way to help with decreasing abortion rates, which, by the way, when you look at the abortion rates of Oregon throughout the years, they are going down. So that is the good news, is we have seen an impact in our communities, is that the overall number has decreased since Roe v. Wade.
You touched on OR 2279, euthanasia. Some of the ways that you dismantle the bodily sovereignty argument in abortion would seem to not apply in regard to physician-assisted suicide. How do you speak to people in that argument?
Yeah, it's difficult because a lot of the idea is that it's your body and you're an adult and right, you have that bodily autonomy. But the focus is on protecting the vulnerable. And who do we have here? And we can also look at what we see in Canada, where their medical assistance in dying MAID is progressed much further than what we have here. And when you're reading accounts, you're looking at cases, what you're finding is that people are able to access things without proper screening. And you're also finding that people are choosing MAID because they do not have proper health care. And so for a chronic health condition, it is cheaper to get medical assistance in dying than it is to get the proper health care for your condition. And it's cheaper for the state as well, right? And so that's a big part of what we're looking at is, do we want to provide good health care, or do we want to just make it easier and cheaper to die? And I think that's really a big part of the conversation is, what social trends are we giving into, what are we encouraging, and where is this ultimately headed alongside the talk? Because if you do it on an individual level of like, what about me and my choice, it's not always as effective. But when you look at the cultural impact and how it affects all these vulnerable people who maybe feel like they're a burden to their family, or this is hard, right? Or they can't afford this medicine. And then physician-assisted suicide is considered the cure-all. That's when people start to get more and more uncomfortable.
When you were talking about the toddler piece of it and the viability piece, you can easily say that a 1-year-old cannot live on their own, right? They can't function on their own and take care of themselves. If you leave them by themselves, they're going to die.
Right.
So, you roll it out like you were doing before. And then these aren't really questions, but I have used this. I read one time, and I don't know if it was all tribes, but that Native Americans had a huge amount of respect for any baby that was born with any kind of disability of any kind, because they looked at it as It must be a very strong spirit that would choose this vessel to go through life in. And I just think that's so beautiful. And I can turn that into my Christian belief and see how God, gives this person this kind of challenge and the people around them this kind of challenge. He must have a lot of confidence in them. And I've used that before when I've talked to people about, well, what about the kids at this, born with these problems? And so, well, did you know that there are Native Americans who believe this? And they're like, that's not a Christian argument. That's them looking at it as, wow, cool, must be a strong spirit inside this one. And I just think that's a beautiful thing. So thought I'd share it.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about people with different abilities and understanding that it's not, an automatic reason that your life is not valuable, for sure.
Okay, I promise this will be my last one. So I have heard, hopefully it's not ever going to happen, and it's coming from a small amount of extreme people, but that even after birth, since, like you said, they can't live on their own after birth, you decide you don't want them, just get rid of them. I have heard that, but.
And so a lot of what that's coming from is probably last summer, there was a law in California that they were looking at that would have to be very careful about the terminology there, because there's the technical terminology and then there's the actual impact. And so the technical terminology is that they would not investigate perinatal deaths within 30 days, I believe it was. And so around birth, within 30 days, they would not investigate a death, whereas they normally would need to. And so technically, it is not approving of infanticide or saying that you legally do have this right, but it is saying we will not investigate. And so part of what they were trying to do with that is to protect women who may be attempting at-home abortions that are not successful as they would have liked. So we will not investigate those. But in reality, what is happening is that there's a window being opened for infanticide. And so the California Family Council and some other groups were able to pressure them to rewrite that language and change it in that law. So that's not going through. But it is something that to be aware of, especially that perinatal death language, for sure.
I read a story where a baby was aborted and it was alive, and they just set it on a shelf and went out for a coffee break. And a nurse came in and got the baby and called 911, and that baby lived. Is that something that if it's not dead yet, they just wait?
So that is a space where the law, federally, there is no law. Oregon, they tried to pass a law about this, and it died in committee. But federally, we do have, after the election and everything, there's been a shift in power, right? And they have passed through the House the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. So they're looking at moving that forward, and that would require physicians to provide life-saving care on a federal level to infants who are born alive during botched abortions. And so the fact that that needs to be a law tells us that that is happening. If you're familiar with Kermit Gosnell, he was an abortion provider in Philadelphia who was a serial killer who would intentionally have babies be born alive in order to kill them afterwards. And that's not the typical face of an abortion provider, but that does happen. And that is one of the instances I read in the testimony, and all of that was babies being born alive and just left to die there. But hopefully we're going to see some federal protection on that level in the near future.
In the media, we really love like the outrageous and outlier stories, right? And there was this story recently, I think it was out of Ohio, about a 10-year-old girl who had been raped by a male relative and was pregnant because our age of puberty is lowering, much lower than it used to be. And you have 8 and 9-year-old girls capable of getting pregnant, but not capable of sustaining that life in any way that's healthy for them or the child. And so when people bring those up, how do you address that, because obviously this is a horrible thing.
Right.
And the fact that we even have to talk about it is really sad. So how do you address those stories that exist but are not common, and how do we talk about those things with people?
Yeah, and that's a very hard one. And one thing, sometimes you want to back the conversation up because that is so emotionally charged that it's hard to make much progress. I know I've had someone walk up to me and say, so you're saying that if your uncle raped you, you would keep the baby? And I'm like, well, let's back up a little bit, right? And let's think about this on a different level. So a lot of it is affirming the concern, being compassionate, saying, yes, these are horrible things. But, would you be okay with a law that restricts abortion, like only exceptions for, say, rape and incest? Like, would you be okay with a law that restricts all except that? Because if you are, then we're part of the way there. I'd be happy with that law too, because it would be progress. But most of the time, people are not okay with that law either. And so then you can walk the conversation back to the broader impact. But on the individual level, it's really just a lot of compassion and saying, so with the 10-year-old in Ohio who crossed state lines to get an abortion, that really is a hot topic right now, and it's what people grab for. And I'd like to say there's a response that's logically consistent and will make people happy, but there is not. And the reality is that life is still a life. And there have been doctors who have done analysis and talked about, how you could help a child that age go through a healthy pregnancy. And the reality is we want to protect that child and her unborn child and protect her from the trauma of having an abortion, in addition to the sexual abuse that she's endured at that young age. And
Trauma of pregnancy.
yes, and the trauma of pregnancy at that age. And just understanding that seeing that something good can come out of this will help much, much more than layering trauma upon trauma. And that's not an easy answer. It's not an answer people are going to like, but it is the answer. And
Justice comes to
yes. Now, I always like to point out that we do not take a stance on the death penalty when we're talking about these cases. So our organization is about protecting innocent, vulnerable life. That does not apply to cases where crimes have been committed. And so, sometimes I mention that because we do want to see justice performed as much as possible.
To go off of that really quick, would that also be a situation where the abuser could be protected, that you could use that argument?
Yes, so if the parents say were unaware about this situation and then the abuser just took her to get an abortion pill somewhere, it could be an instance where you see the abuser being protected, able to cover up his tracks. And it's just a horrifying idea, really, that it's that simple.
My two questions were, one regarding the two laws that are in legislation right now. Now, my understanding is those are not things that we as citizens get to vote on, but the legislators? Okay. And then secondly, when you were talking about the Plan C pill, that's being prescribed, basically self-prescribed?
So it varies a little bit. And what I found is I've just tried going on to their website and seeing how far I can get through the process without having to submit any documentation. It's pretty far. You can obtain it without really seeing a doctor. With telehealth, maybe you have an appointment, but it's very easy to obtain without going through proper medical screening. And it's also actively encouraged to buy it, stock it up for your friends, that kind of idea. And so it's just very, very prevalent, very accessible, and it's very underreported. So it's also hard to know in that sense.
And along with that, is there risk for someone who says that or thinks that they're pregnant and might take it? Or do you know?
Yeah, I don't know in that sense. I would assume so, because the misoprostol induces labor. So if you're not pregnant, that would be pretty traumatic for the body. So that would be my assumption there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any hazards to this pill with regard to term, like where they are in the pregnancy also?
I believe it has more to do with how effective it is in terminating a pregnancy, is why they have those restrictions, but people are using it beyond when the FDA, I was going to say allows, I guess when the FDA has regulated it for. Yeah.
My husband and I heard about the movie Unplanned, and it was very effective. And, excuse me, anyone who has not had the opportunity to see Unplanned, it would be, if you could find the movie, you won't be sorry that you watched it. It's pretty eye-opening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of great content, and it's helpful for understanding. Abby Johnson is not the only Planned Parenthood executive or director who has come over to the pro-life side because of what she has seen. And I just heard from Myra Rodriguez, ran a Planned Parenthood in Arizona, and she was a whistleblower because of the rules they broke there, the health violations she saw, and she was unanimously awarded by the jury $3 million for wrongful termination because they fired her after she said, hey, there's these problems. And so it is an interesting trend, the Planned Parenthood workers who have come over to the pro-life side.
Can I just say one more thing? Write down to the poor gentleman who was responsible for taking what they term the toxic waste,
Mm-hmm.
having to drive his truck in there and having to take these barrels out, knowing what was in the barrels was going to absolutely traumatize him for the rest of his life. And it was part of his job to go there and do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it just goes down the line.
Right. The impact, does not stop with the mother and the father of the child. It continues out and how it impacts our society, for sure. Yeah.
You said that there's no law on who can perform abortions. So how does the Planned Parenthood answer this? That one of their arguments is we need legal abortions because women have been using back alley abortions and dying.
Right.
And yet they will support a law that doesn't even require them to be up to medical standards.
Right. So in that case, there are some regulations surrounding who can be performing abortions, but they're not held to the same standard as someone performing a surgery in another context. So there are some regulations, but it's a much lower bar than it is for other surgeries and invasive procedures. And so, that's one of the big things is the idea that we need abortion to be safe, legal, and rare, and it is none of those three things, even though it is legal. Well, it's legal, but it's not rare and it's not safe, regardless. And so that's one of the big questions it's responding to is it's still safer to have abortion banned because women are still dying from the impacts today under the safer regime.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for very insightful questions. And we want to especially thank Makaira for coming. And yes. And just teaching us more about what is going on in our world and what we can do about it. And thank you for giving us steps like realistic steps that we can take today to make a difference. I believe we have somebody scheduled for a prayer. All right, thank you.
Let's pray. Holy Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity just to consider these issues of the day. We want to have an impact on our communities. We want to be salt and light where we live and in our spheres of influence. And I know that much of what was said today will help us to do a better job of that. We ask your blessing on Makaira and the ministry that she's involved in. And we pray, Father, that we would collectively create a culture of life in this state as well as the world that we live in. And we just thank you so much for the wisdom and the knowledge that has brought us to this point in our lives where we can understand and articulate the real issues that are vital to the world that we live in. Just bless us all, Father, and help us to be courageous in how we articulate the truth that you've given us this day. And bless us all. These things we pray in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen.